in the same folder. Yeah. Just a criticism. Alright, are you all ready? Okay, is anyone not ready? Good? Okay. We're going to go ahead and start out on the perm debate. They say perm because the K is mutually exclusive. 1. It's impossible to embrace a neoliberal epistemology that makes extinction inevitable while trying to solve back to the exact same thing. 2. Only the world of the criticism guarantees 0% risk of conflict, environmental degradation, and extinction. The affirmative is the opposite. 3. The perm shouldn't be allowed because the K acts as a DA to the permutation. The K is mutually exclusive. 4. The permutation ensures co-option. Political action is only possible if it directly engages in existing hegemonic coordinates. They ensure the collapse of the transition. Z11. One should resist the quick transition of the energy protest into a set of concrete pragmatic demands. Yes, the protesters created back in the field of hegemonic ideology. They were allowing their political engagements to be outsourced. They wanted back the art of politics is also to insist on a particular demand that while the realist disturbs the very core of hegemonic ideology, we should definitely mobilize people to make such demands. It is no less important to simultaneously remain subtracted from the pragmatic field of negotiations. Any debate here and now necessarily remains a debate on the enemy's turf. All we can say now can be taken from us except our silence. The silence, this rejection of dialogue, is our terror, ominous and threatening as it should be. And we must separate our discourse from capitalist governmentality of knowledge production, forcing its economic understanding of the world upon the population and producing them as human subjects. Only a prior rejection of the capitalist-based approach can open new avenues to understanding a new strategy from Marty 96. The failure of our social immune system to respond to the cancerous forms of capitalism is understandable once we realize that the organs of post-social bodies across the world. Our social immune system has been greatly compromised by the accelerating control of the multinational capital conglomerates over information. Because of the subordination of social systems of research communications to transnational capital control, whatever does recognize the capitalist cancer is normally rejected. Effective response now committedly requires global determination to resist, regulate, and beat back the lethal, uncontrolled growth and menaces of cancerous capitalism. Okay, let's move on to the impact level of the criticism. 1. You should preference everyday violence for 2 reasons. A. Social bias underrepresents its effects, and B. Its effects are exponential, not linear, which means even if it only causes a small amount of structural violence, its internal impacts are huge. Nixon 11. We need to rethink slow violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, dispersed across time and space. Violence is customarily conceived as an event that is immediate in time. We need to engage in a different kind of violence that is neither incremental, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. We also need to engage the representational challenges posed by the relative invisibility of slow violence. Climate change, toxic drift, deforestation, the radioactive aftermath of wars, a dissipation of oceans, and a host of other slowly unfolding environmental catastrophes present formidable representational obstacles that can hinder our efforts to mobilize. Representational obstacles that can hinder our effort. The long dives are underrepresented in the strategic planning as well as in human memory. Advocating invading countries with mass forms of slow motion toxicity requires rethinking our accepted assumptions of violence to include slow violence. Such a rethinking requires that we complicate conventional assumptions about violence as event focused. We need to account for how the temporal dispersion of slow violence affects the way we perceive a variety of social afflictions. Slow violence is often not just attritional but also exponential, operating as a major threat multiplier. It can fuel long-term proliferating conflicts in situations where the conditions for sustaining life become increasingly but gradually degraded. And prioritizing everyday violence is key. Responding to it later causes error replication and movement burnout. Only reorienting the focus away from macro-level violence produces sustainable political coalitions. Cuomo 96. Theory that does not investigate the omnipresence of militarism cannot address the depth of everyday effects of militarism. These effects justify the destruction of natural non-human entities and communities during peacetime. Ethical approaches that do not attend to the ways in which warfare are driven into the very fabric of life lead to crisis-based politics and analysis. Crisis-based politics are problematic because they distract attention away from the need for sustained resistance to enmeshed systems of domination. Neglecting the omnipresence of militarism allows the false belief that the absence of declared armed conflicts is peace. It is particularly easy for those whose lives are shaped by privilege. Resistance is immobilized when the real violence finally occurs, or when privilege is threatened, and at that point it is difficult to not respond to ways that make resistors drop all other political priorities. Crisis-driven attention keep resistors complacent. Seeing war as necessarily embedded draws attention to the fact that horrific violence is happening nearly all over. Let's go down to the link debate. Okay, I'm going to touch really lightly on framework here for just a second. In framework, so on the framework debate, they talk about how they are affirming, reaffirming this idea of prostitution. They meet our interpretation of that. They want to discuss this idea of prostitution. That's where we garner our link to this. Prostitution is under this capitalist environment, and that's where the link comes into this. Regardless of what you think on the framework debate, you have to realize that how they answer framework debate links them directly into the CAPK. Prostitution under a capitalist environment requires a constant process of self-commodification that saturates it into a violent market process. O'Connell, Davison, 14. A wage laborer's resemblance to prostitution is heightened by the culture of capitalism further advanced towards a universal commodification, one that tends to be attributes and characteristics of the selfless cultures which we are all increasingly able to think of our looks, aptitude, skill, strength, smile, personality, and so on as abstract as components of the portfolio of assets to be sold on the power market. The link between the value attached to a person's labor, power, and the ability to package and sell disassembled aspects of the body and self is increasingly a feature of work in many sectors, including higher education may be possible to return to earlier understanding of capitalist environment, employment regulations such as with the postulate or recognition that all paid work, including prostitution, commodifies but is integral to and invisible from our embodied selves and connects us to a broader political struggle to a halt and reverse the current global trend towards abandoning the collective responsibility for individual welfare and supporting any resistance to rising whims of the market. It would require us to recognize and challenge other ways in which personhood is far from being status universally enjoyed by all flesh and blood human beings, and it's constituted through a specific exclusionary process in the practices of citizenship regulation of employment and labor markets and the ordering of public and private space, crucially focus on the prostitutes and other workers share the experiences and aspects of their embodied selves, helps to reveal what is wrong with this kind of commodification under the existing global and social realizations of capitalism. People can say no to any act of self-commodification when they have an alternative means of supporting themselves in their defense without genuinely universal protections from, as well as in the capitalist labor market. Many people say experience of prostitution and other forms of paperwork will continue to look like wage slavery, and the alternative is to challenge the ontological framework of capitalism by breaking away from this ontological, from a political ontology. We can introduce the alternative means in the political arena, including justice and solidarity. You need to put ontology first. Oksala in 11. The implication of the relationship between neoliberalism and violence is there can be no cost-effective and rational violence that can function as resistance. Behavior should not be reduced to cost-effective means. If we want to impose neoliberalism as a socio-political matrix, we have to challenge the ontological framework that explains behavior through the economic analysis. The relationship between neoliberalism and violent resistance does not imply that only meaningful form of protest is violence. We should question neoliberalism's state through rationality and introduce alternative means and ends to justice, compassion, creativity, and solidarity. Not unlike Nazism and communism, neoliberalism contains an explicit worldview that holds metaphysical assumptions by maintaining a belief that human beings are always rational, driven by self-interest. The free competition and privileging of market mechanisms are understood as a means for a good life. The free market is an economic, moral, and political force. Neoliberalism maps a cognitive space for individuals with very clear objectives. Money is the greatest instrument of freedom. The political ontology has become deeply ingrained, constitutive of our life world and ourselves. We have become entrepreneurs competing in the free market called society. Within this framework, irrational violence is simply a losing strategy. This remains its appeal and significance. Okay, so I'm going to go back, I guess, and do an underview of this. Okay, so on the perm debate, what they can't perm because the K is mutually exclusive. The Z-type evidence is really good on this. It talks about how, or like, actually when you perm to like look at the alt, like you can focus on the alt debate too if you'd like, how we can't even look at the world of the alt before we have this like rejection of this. And the criticism is actually like a disadvantage to the permutation because it's mutually exclusive. Like the criticism is able to solve back for all the impacts in their case and then the impacts that we see from having this capitalist society. On the role of the ballot debate, she says that they like meet our role of the ballot. We say that it's the role of the ballot should go to whoever best like releases the grip of capitalism on debate. Right now, like this is how they get another link into the criticism, is that prostitution is under this capitalist movement. This requires self-commodification and like puts it back into this violent market process. And that like because capitalism is inherently bad, like look at the impacts of it. We need to put ontology on top and value that first and learn like how we relate to ourselves and then reject like while we're rejecting capitalism, and that's how we're able to solve back for all of their impacts. Yeah. Prospects.
Okay. You say that the perm ensures co-option, but what if it's a time frame permutation?
What do you mean?
Will that still mean co-option? That means we do one first.
All right. So when you say like do the app and then do the alt, like
yeah.
We still say that you need to put ontology and the alternative first, because that's the only way that you're not going to get like error replication and things like that. Like,
what ontology are we putting first? Because you said the ontology and the alt. So what ontology exactly?
With the ontology, like the Oksala evidence is talking about how we need to learn our relationships like to ourselves and with other people before we can like go in and like talk about like capitalism.
Okay. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
What do you mean by everyday violence?
That talks about like how capitalism as a whole is what's like the root cause of all your impacts.
In a vacuum, what is everyday violence?
Like that's the structural violence that your impacts and our impacts are talking about. That's
okay.
Capitalism is the root cause of all of that. The Oksala
structural
evidence,
violence. Okay.
Yeah.
Is psychological violence considered structural violence?
I would say yes, and that capitalism is still the root cause of that.
You say that, okay, in your Cuomo 96 card,
yeah.
you say that we need to shift from a macro level analysis of violence to what?
That's, Point 196 says that we need to stop looking at like the big things that are happening and start looking at like how capitalism is the root cause of this to stop this like the structural violence that we're
So,
seeing.
what do you mean by macro level violence?
Like the big impacts, not like
Okay, so is psychological violence a big, what do you mean by a big impact?
like I mean like a war, something like that. Versus
Do
like
we have those kind of impacts in our
no,
app?
that's why I'm reading this, saying that we need to, as a whole, that's what the criticism says that we should do, is stop looking at this, look how capitalism is the root cause of this and how rejecting it solves for the big impacts and the small impacts.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
we
fine.
need to look at how our
Yeah.
relationship, like how everything is profit driven. Oksala and 11 talks about that too. How even though you may affirm prostitution, it's still going to be profit driven. You link into that as well.
How do we link it to that?
Because you affirm prostitution. And within a capitalist society, everything's profit driven. Oksala and 11 talks about it. It's like the first line.
Okay, can you repeat that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. So Oksala and 11,
Mhm.
let me find it, says that it's like right at the top of the page break where it says by maintaining a belief that human beings are always rational beings driven by natural self-interest, free competition, privileged market mechanisms, understood as means for a good life. Like all of this, the second part that's after the page break is talking about how everyone becomes profit driven in this society.
Okay.
Like you still see your
Can you-
impacts because of capitalism.
Do you need
And third.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
Do you